The Channel Islands, a rugged and windswept archipelago off the coast of California, have long stood as isolated sentinels in the Pacific. Among them, San Nicolas Island bears a particularly enigmatic history. Once considered one of 8 potential test sites for a nuclear detonation during World War II, it was ultimately spared such destruction. Instead, the United States Navy repurposed it as a weapons testing and training facility, a role it continues to serve to this day. Situated approximately 61 miles from the California mainland, San Nicolas spans roughly 22 square miles. Despite its isolation, it is home to a contingent of around 200 military and civilian personnel. Radar stations and telemetry equipment dot its barren landscape, silently monitoring the vast expanse of sky and sea. The island itself is just over 9 miles long and 3 miles wide, a compact yet formidable outpost in the Pacific. Some of the civilian staff have worked on the island for decades, and over the years they have collected a trove of peculiar accounts from the military personnel stationed there. Strange echoes in the wind, shadows where none should be, and an ever-present feeling of being watched, San Nicolas Island holds secrets that go beyond its official purpose. In the late 1980s, a series of unsettling events unfolded on San Nicolas Island, forming one of the more chilling examples of unexplained phenomena recorded there. The account begins with a serviceman recounting an experience he had while stationed on the island, an experience that, to this day, defies explanation. I was stationed on St. Nick in the late 80s as an electronics technician, but spent most of my time servicing the various radar and telemetry stations throughout the island. St. Nick was a small outpost and was showing its age by the time of my duty. Most of the time, there were only routine maintenance procedures, since the salt air wreaked havoc on the equipment. We were keeping up with maintenance and getting prepared for the next test they were going to do. Unless there was something big going off at Vandenberg, it was a pretty quiet post. All the base facilities and housing were focused in an area called Nicktown. They had a bowling alley and a small shop. There wasn't a whole lot to do. The island itself is pretty desolate. The only thing I was told is if it's foggy and it's nighttime, you don't want to venture too far from any place that's well lit. The entire island's for the most part surrounded by cliffs. I spent the first few months getting to know everybody, learning how to do my job, and getting a general feel for the layout of the island and the base itself. I was working primarily with a petty officer by the last name of Reynolds. We spent a lot of our time traveling around the island as needed, but when there wasn't a real need to go around the island, we pretty much stayed in Nicktown. Reynolds had been on the island for 6 months, and he knew the person I replaced. He said he was a good guy, but towards the end, he was a little bit spooked by something. To help keep his identity private, we'll just call him Piper. Apparently, Piper was sent out in the fog to take care of some issues that happened at one of the telemetry stations. It was approximately 3.5 miles away from Nicktown. Reynolds said that he was threatened with an Article 15 for failure to fulfill his duties. He had gone to the radar site, failed to rig the repairs that were required, and then left the site unsecured. When he returned back to the post, he seemed shaken. When he went back to Nicktown, Reynolds said he was never the same. There was something off about him. Something out there had scared him. I never repeated what Reynolds told me, and Reynolds had never told the story to anyone else but me. The base kinda swept it under the rug. We didn't talk much more about it for quite some time, but we did give that radar post a nickname, Station Piper. About a month later, when Vandenberg was testing another missile and we had some issues with the telemetry station, this time it was my turn to check out Station Piper. But I would be lucky. I would be able to take Reynolds with me. They didn't want anyone to come back this time, scared or failing to do their job. Besides, it's easier to have a buddy holding the flashlight than have to hold it all by yourself. We packed up the service truck and started heading down the road. Took us a little bit longer than normal. The fog was so thick we could barely see past the headlights. We pulled up to Station Piper and left the truck running. The headlights were pointed at the door into the building. These buildings are watertight. They don't want the humidity and salt air in there ruining the electronics. Reynolds was testing the equipment while I was running down a checklist. We'd only been there about 10 minutes when the radio started acting up. It was making a strange, irritating buzzing noise, and it wouldn't stop, so we just turned it off. We could hear the one in the truck going off too, but we didn't pay any attention to it. Reynolds laughed and joked about the fact that Piper used to turn his radio off when he came to the station. I didn't want to act like I was scared, so I turned the radio back on, and that's when we heard it. You could hear this faint whispering. It was creepy and unnatural. At first, you couldn't make out what was being said. I decided I'd get a radio check, and we got a check back from Nicktown. Radio was apparently working fine, but instead of dead air and silence, when you weren't pushing the button down, you got whispering, and it got louder. Reynolds noticed it and looked at me. I looked at him and shook my head and said, "I don't know what's going on." The whispering got louder and you could make out words, but it wasn't English. You could hear a number of voices speaking over each other. I told Reynolds, "I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not superstitious, but I do know when something's not right." I turned off the radio and we redoubled our efforts to get out of there. And no sooner had we decided that something wasn't right when things got real wrong. We didn't waste any time. Reynolds gathered up his tools. I gathered up the paperwork. We secured the building and started making our way to the truck. As we approached the truck, it shut off. It wouldn't turn. It was completely dead. We didn't have headlights. We both looked at each other for a moment in confusion. I wouldn't say at this point we were in a full state of panic, but as we were looking at each other with apprehension, I know we were both thinking the same thing. This is how it must have started for Piper. I popped the hood to that truck, and Reynolds and I went out there determined to figure out what the hell was going on. We spent a few minutes cleaning up the battery cables, and I got inside that cab and started that truck right up. Reynolds put the hood down, and that's when I saw what Piper must have seen. Just out of the range of the headlights, about 6 or 7 feet in the air, was a pair of glowing red eyes. I'd never seen anything like it, and there's nothing on that island that stands that tall. I must have had some sort of strange look on my face of shock or concern, because when Reynolds got into the cab of the truck, he said, "What the hell's wrong with you? Let's get out of here." And that's when I pointed down the road and I said, "Do you see that?" We both sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. And that's when we both realized whatever it was closing the distance between us. It was approaching the truck, and I said, "To hell with this." I turned the truck around and started heading back to base faster than what's safe. We had to keep slowing down since the old service truck had no fog lights, and the headlights blinded us in the thicker patches. You just couldn't see much further than the front of the truck. That's when Reynolds said, "It's still there, man. You've got to go." He was right. I looked in the rearview mirror, and they were there. 2 glowing red eyes and some huge shadowy form. I couldn't believe it. At this point, we were in a full panic. We knew something evil was chasing us down that road. If it hadn't been for the damned fog, I would have pushed that truck as fast as it would go. As we drove down the road, the fog began to lift and the eyes disappeared. We made the left-hand turn to head back towards Nicktown. We could see the base lights glowing through the fog. And as we started around the final corner, both of us noticed that there were these shadows running alongside the truck. They were human-shaped and moving almost 50 miles an hour. What the hell does that? Reynolds and I just focused on getting back to the base. We were white-knuckling it all the way back. When Reynolds and I got back to base, we parked the truck in the garage and secured the doors. We tried to act normal, but kept looking over our shoulders and staring into the fields just across the yard. We felt uneasy walking back to our stations. We were speechless. The following morning, we agreed to never speak of it. I never mentioned this to anybody, and I'm sure he never mentioned it to anyone he knows either. We didn't know what happened, but we knew one thing for sure. We understand what Piper experienced at this point, and whatever it was, he was alone that night it went after him. At least we had completed the repairs, so we didn't have to return to Station Piper. Thankfully, we were rotated to day crew the next week, and I was sent to Point Mugu a few months later. What is it about San Nicolas Island that stirs whispers of the supernatural? Why do dark, shadowy figures seem to roam the island at night, chasing those who dare to tread its desolate roads? Today, San Nicolas Island belongs to the US Navy, serving as part of the Naval Air Warfare Center's Sea Test Range, associated with the Weapons Division at Point Mugu. It hosts a 10,000-foot runway, sophisticated missile tracking systems, and launch sites for test operations. Scattered across the island are mock cities, their empty structures used for urban warfare training, silent and empty most of the time. A place built for war and weaponry, far removed from the civilization that once thrived there. But to understand the island's true nature, its sense of unease, its lingering weight of sorrow, we must look to its original inhabitants. Archaeological evidence suggests that San Nicolas Island, like the other Channel Islands, was inhabited for at least 10,000 years, though not necessarily without interruption. When Spanish explorers sailed past in the 1500s, they made no mention of its native people. They merely recorded the island's presence on their charts and moved on, oblivious to the civilization that had long called it home. At the time, the island was inhabited by the Nicoleño people, a peaceful and resourceful society closely related to those of Santa Catalina and San Clemente Islands. Some historians believe their population may have once reached as many as 1,000 individuals. By the late 18th century, Spanish missionaries began removing the native people from these coastal islands, incorporating them into the mainland's mission system, sometimes by force. Those taken from their ancestral land found themselves imprisoned within mission walls, subjected to brutal labor and foreign customs. The Nicoleño, known for their trust and hospitality, were unprepared for the devastation that followed. They had built their homes from the great bones of whales washed ashore, their existence entwined with the rhythms of the ocean. But soon, their way of life would be shattered. Founded in 1799, under the sponsorship of the Russian Emperor, the Russian-American company controlled the Alaskan fur trade and expanded Russian influence through permanent settlements along the North American west coast. As part of its operations, the company dispatched hunting expeditions to procure valuable sea otter pelts. This exploitive trade often led to conflicts with indigenous populations. One such confrontation occurred in 1814 between the Nicoleño and a Russian-American company vessel. According to RAC records, the Ilmena, a 200-ton otter hunting vessel, included a group of conscripted native Aleutian seal hunters. Tasked with harvesting the region's otters and seals, the crew's activities quickly drew the attention of the Nicoleño people, who had long relied on the marine ecosystem for survival. A group of Aleutian seal hunters ventured too close to a Nicoleño village, disregarding the tribe's warnings to leave. As the seal hunters continued to hunt extensively, tensions rose. The Nicoleño confronted the hunters, demanding compensation for the aggressive overhunting and total disregard of tribal warnings. A violent altercation ensued, culminating in the death of an Aleut. In response, the hunters launched a brutal reprisal, indiscriminately killing Nicoleño men, women, and children. By the time the violence ended, fewer than 30 Nicoleño remained. Their population had been devastated and their way of life irreparably altered. Among the survivors, many of the women had endured sexual assaults at the hands of the hunters. By the 1830s, their numbers had dwindled further, with some accounts estimating only around 20 individuals remaining. Other sources suggest as few as 7 survivors, 6 women, and an elderly man known as Black Hawk. Black Hawk, who had sustained a head injury during the massacre, was among the last of his people, bearing both the physical and cultural scars of the tragedy that had befallen the Nicoleño. Speculation exists that the Franciscan padres of the California missions ordered the removal of the last remaining Nicoleños from San Nicolas Island, yet no historical records confirm this claim. By the 1830s, the California missions were undergoing secularization. This would imply that at the time of Nicoleño relocations, the San Gabriel mission lacked a resident Franciscan priest to receive any displaced islanders. Although some refer to this as a rescue effort, many have since called it a forced relocation into the often oppressive mission system. In late November 1835, the schooner Peores Nada, commanded by Charles Hubbard, set sail from Southern California to retrieve the island's remaining inhabitants. Upon reaching San Nicolas, Hubbard's party, including trader Isaac Sparks, gathered the Nicoleños on the shore and brought them aboard. However, one individual was unintentionally left behind. Before a full search could be conducted, a severe storm descended upon the island. With treacherous surf and rocky waters threatening the vessel, the crew of the Peores Nada made the critical decision to depart immediately. In their rush to escape the worsening conditions, they were forced to abandon Juana Maria, leaving her to survive in complete isolation on San Nicolas Island for the next 18 years. Several versions of the story surrounding Juana Maria's abandonment have been proposed. One account suggests that, upon realizing her brother was not aboard the Peores Nada, Juana leapt overboard in a desperate attempt to join him. Another version speculates that she was not alone on the island when the ship departed, but rather abandoned with her brother, her child, and the elderly man named Black Hawk. However, these versions have been largely discredited, particularly as Black Hawk was actually taken in the Hubbard relocation. Juana Maria, estimated to be 32 years old at the time of her abandonment, would later be known as the Lone Woman of San Nicolas Island. For nearly 2 decades, she wandered the desolate island, its windswept cliffs and empty shores offering her no company but the ruins of her people. In her isolation, she was left to endure profound loss, with no one to speak to and no one to offer solace. Meanwhile, many of the relocated Nicoleño were sent to mission San Gabriel Arcangel, where they suffered from diseases to which they had no immunity. Black Hawk, after arriving at the mission, became blind, and soon after, he tragically fell from a steep bank and drowned. The others who had been relocated appeared to have perished as well, leaving Juana Maria the sole survivor of her people when she was finally relocated. In 1850, Father Gonzalez of Mission Santa Barbara enlisted Thomas Jeffries to search for Juana. Jeffries was unable to locate her, but his stories upon returning to San Francisco ignited the imagination of Captain George Nidever. Inspired by these tales, Nidever launched several expeditions of his own to find her. In 1853, after 2 failed attempts, one of Captain George's men, Carl Dittman, discovered human footprints on the beach, alongside pieces of seal blubber left out to dry. Following these signs, the search party eventually located Juana. She was living in a crude hut partially constructed from whale bones, wearing a dress made of greenish cormorant feathers. She was relocated to Santa Barbara and lived with the captain and his wife. Despite the isolation and language barrier, Juana Maria's joy at encountering new people was evident. She was particularly fascinated by the horses, European clothing, and food she encountered. Unfortunately, her time on the mainland was short-lived. Just 7 weeks after her arrival, Juana died from dysentery in Gary, California. It's believed that her fondness for fresh corn, vegetables, and fruit, after years of limited and poor nutrition, contributed to the illness. Before her death, Father Sanchez baptized her, giving her the Spanish name Juana Maria. She was buried in an unmarked grave at the Santa Barbara Mission Cemetery, and Father González Rubio recorded her burial in the mission's Book of Burials. In 1928, a plaque was placed at the site of her grave by the Daughters of the American Revolution in her honor. However, much of her material culture, including her water basket, clothing, and bone needles, artifacts brought back from Nicolas Island, were destroyed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. The dress made from cormorant feathers, which was reportedly sent to the Vatican, has since been lost. After the island was abandoned, visitors began scavenging for artifacts and burial sites, with many graves being disturbed. By 1896, hundreds of graves had been dug up, with human remains carelessly thrown into piles. Over the years, 469 human remains and 436 burial objects were recovered from the island. In response to the desecration, leaders from the Pechanga band of ᴸᴺᴬᵗᵛ Indians, who claimed cultural ties to the Nicoleños, visited the island. With the approval of the US Navy, they asserted a cultural claim to the remains and artifacts, seeking to protect and honor what was left of the island's native history. Given the violence and sorrow etched into the land, it's no surprise that strange occurrences are often reported on San Nicolas Island. The disrespect for the dead and the desecration of Nicoleño graves serve as a painful reminder of the island's dark history, and the spiritual weight of these actions continues to resonate. This story was researched and written by J. Allen, who felt deeply impacted by the history uncovered in the process. Juana Maria and the Nicoleño people were described as friendly, resourceful, and eager to make new friends. They were at one with nature and deserved so much better. The immense suffering endured by California's Native American populations is a tragedy that cannot be overlooked. Rather than altering historical facts to make advertisers happy or tragedies more palatable, we prefer to be as direct and honest as possible. Watering down the crimes of history only serves to further victimize the victims. Though this journey ends on a somber note, we hope this story was meaningful to you. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to learn, and to remember those that history has forgotten.